Welcome to week 6, and we'll sort of get we've got a bit of a select little group in the room tonight. It seems like quite a lot of people are listening to the recording, so we apologise for the little issues we had during the week, but hopefully that's just something that happened last week and that won't sort of recur. So as you know, what we've been working on so far has been around legislation, and last week there was lots around delegated legislation. And so this is now the next module, which is all about case law and helping you understand more about law reports. So in the first bit of this evening, we're going to explore the whole concept of case law, go back and talk a little bit more about doctrine of precedent and the hierarchy of courts and law reporting. So a lot of this we touched on very, very briefly at the beginning when we provided the whole context of the Australian legal system. So it's a bit of a refresher. You might have forgotten some of it, but as I say, we didn't go into a lot of detail. So it will contextualise it all again for you so that rather than just take law reports out as totally out of context, we'll feed it all in together. And so let's get going. So case law, remember we understand that case law is the common law as developed by the judges, and so in the courts. And so in Australia we have very strict separation of powers between the Parliament and to a certain extent the executive government, although there's a little bit of intertwining in this country, but then very strict separation with the judiciary on the other side, so that the courts cannot interfere in the business of Parliament, and Parliament cannot interfere in the business of the judiciary. But of course there is some interplay in terms of the connections where legislation and case law do intersect in different ways. So very often the focus in legal research, not always, but it focuses on things that are heard in what we term the superior courts. And we'll explain that in a little bit more detail as we go through. So case law is quite different from the law that we do find in statutes and delegated legislation, which is what we've covered in a bit more detail so far. So a case, a law case, represents the solution, hopefully, to a particular dispute about which the trial judge or the bench of an appeal court, so the judges there, have made a decision. So there might be in the lower courts you'll have a single judge, and then on the courts of appeal, the higher courts there, you'll have a bench with a number of judges. So it's not just one person's decision. There needs to be consensus reached as to what the outcome of the case might be. So broadly speaking, judges do make decisions in order to resolve disputes rather than preventing them. If you remember when we started talking about legislation, we were sort of saying that the laws are very often in place to try and avoid litigious situations so that people understand where they're going. But it's not perfect, it's not a perfect world, and so very often things do come before the courts. So legislation, as we've discussed, is made to regulate the different situations in society and therefore theoretically prevent the opportunity for disputes to arise. So legislation is very ambitious. It tries to actually cover all bases so that there's a complete framework of rules to govern any particular situation. Whereas judges, it's not so holistic. They're looking at very often very fine points of law, something very, very special that is before them. And I think we've mentioned before, in some situations you might have the same parties going to court about multiple issues because the actual different areas of dispute are different and they need to be heard differently as well. And that's particularly the situation in tax law. So there can be that series of cases to look at all of that. So where there isn't some interaction between case law and legislation, the fundamental rule is that legislation takes precedent over case law, which is the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy over the courts, which goes right back in history again to the Stuart kings and things that were going on in England in the 17th century. So parliaments can change case law rules, so where they think the judiciary may have acted not in the way that they'd like to see it happen, there can be some legislation brought in to change those rules. If you remember last week we looked at High Court rules as delegated legislation and family court rules, etc. So there are those areas around things that the Parliament can do. But generally courts resolve disputes sometimes, for example, over the meaning of words presented in the statute. So that's another area where they intersect. The legislation contains certain words and phrases, and if they need to be interpreted in a special way, the courts can then sort of do that interpretation. Also, it all comes back to the Constitution as well. The first 3 chapters of the Australian Constitution relate to the separation of powers. So Chapter 1 deals with Parliament, Chapter 2 deals with the executive arm of government, and Chapter 3 deals with the judiciary. So it's worth having a look at those. The current if you just Google for the Australian Constitution, there's a version out there that has an overview and an introduction by the Australian Government Solicitor. And so that puts it very much in plain English what it's all about. And good general knowledge stuff, I think, to understand how all these things come together. So basically the courts need to ensure that the legislative bodies, so the Parliament, have actually complied with their constitutional requirements. Okay, so there's a little bit of a watching brief from both sides. Parliament's looking out to see that the judiciary is doing the right thing, but at the same time the judiciary is making sure that the lawmakers are also behaving in a constitutional way as well. So that's be interesting to see what happens in America in the coming months as well, to see how that all plays out there too. So we talked at the very beginning about the development of the common law. So you can go, if you've forgotten it, you can go back to our early classes to review that. But the development of the common law, it came back down to the real importance of having reliable law reports. So that because of the doctrine of precedent, where common law depends on decisions that have been made in the past, and those sort of common law will prevail through the later decisions, then you do need those reliable law reports. So not every case is reported and doesn't need to be. So cases are actually selected for reporting when they do raise a point of legal significance. So that's important to understand. You need to know which ones are being reported and how they are important to the legal profession. And that's where the commentary comes in as well. So the case digests that you get, the different encyclopedias provide detail, and the very specialised loose-leaf services where there is a new case that is reported, then very often it's like a flurry of activity around it, why it's important and how it actually is drawing upon some different point of legal significance there. So going right the way back, we had, if you remember, the nominate reports. So they took the name of an individual reporter, and that was where it was beginning to feel like it was a little bit unreliable, because the individual reporters were writing in their own style, their own narratives. And so there need to be more consensus and coordination around the law reports. And so the Incorporated Council of Law Reporting was established way back in 1865. So some of those nominate reports were republished, if you like, in the English reports. So during that period of 1900 to 1932. So again, the history is really important. Occasionally you do need to go back to case law that does come from the English jurisdiction. So you need to be aware of it and what might be able to come through. So as I just mentioned, the doctrine of precedent. This is the idea that a matter that is before the courts must be dealt with in the same way based on the decisions that have been made in the past by earlier judges. So that in Latin is the stare decisis, so let the decision stand. And there's the more Latin words which relate to following the rationale of past cases. So the important principle is the material facts must be the same, and this is where the lawyers, with the different, for example, the scenarios that we've been working with, there must be very similar situations with the same issues being raised for that sort of doctrine of precedent to apply. And this is an important bit for you to really note as well. The court where the previous decision has been handed down must be a higher court in the same legal system. Okay, so we'll look at the hierarchy of courts in a bit more detail just now. But to give you an example there, what we mean by a legal system in Australia, it will be the jurisdiction. Okay, our courts, our states and territories as jurisdictions. So if there's a decision handed down, so a single judge in the New South Wales Supreme Court, as an example, the doctrine of precedent goes up to the New South Wales Court of Appeal. So that's where you've got the bench of number of judges hearing an appellate and appeal case. But the full court, which is also an appellate court, but in Victoria, then that would not be binding through the doctrine of precedent. It needs to be in the same jurisdiction. But obviously there can be information and the generation of ideas coming from related cases in other jurisdictions. But it's not binding, as we say, for it to go through that way. So it is essential when you're doing case law research to find out whether a certain case, the one that you're looking at the moment, has actually been overruled by a superior court. So there's lots that you sort of need to get your head around in terms of, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail, in terms of the way different cases are handled. And this is certainly where some of the online services like LexisNexis, AU and Westlaw come into their own. In the strength of theirs is that they actually provide very good guidance about how good a case is, whether it is good law. So let's just look at the hierarchy of courts and then the different elements of it and how they all relate together. So not every jurisdiction is the same. They do vary, but there's a similar general structure that applies across the different areas. So most, what we term superior courts, we'll look at that, there's an original jurisdiction and an appellate jurisdiction. So where the original case is heard, and then if the outcome isn't as the parties would wish to see, there's a right of appeal, and that would then go to an appellate court in that same jurisdiction. So that screenshot there is a little bit busy. The sort of straw type things or lines link each together, so there's different areas there. But the main sort of, the top of the hierarchy here in Australia is the High Court of Australia, and that's in Canberra. And if you come sort of down the centre of the slide, you can see there's a full court of the Federal Court, which is an appellate court, and then you've got the Federal Court of Australia. Okay, so that's, then if you come off on a tangent down towards the left-hand corner, you can see there's the Federal Magistrates Court, or that's changed its name, as also explained just now as well. That little group on the left-hand side is the family. There's a different jurisdiction in a different sense, family law, and there you've got the family court and the full court, which is the appellate court for the family court. And then you've got some other, in WA there's a family court there as well. If you continue down to the very bottom line, there's of the screen there's actually federal tribunals. Tribunals are slightly different as well. They're not sort of the principal courts, but they play an important role as well. Then over on the right-hand side, you can sort of see the states and territories, so their area of activity. And there'll be a court of appeal or a full court, or a Court of Criminal Appeal, and it just varies what it's entitled in the different jurisdictions of the different states and territories. Then there'll be a Supreme Court, which is the main starting point for them. And then there are specialist courts and tribunals across those different areas. Below, and that's sort of coming, sorry, it's a bit complicated, the Supreme Court, if you look at Supreme Courts of states and territory, there's a line that goes down to district courts and county courts, they're referred to in Victoria. So we'll explain as we go through what type of legal matters might be heard in what type of courts. But that gives you, there's lots of diagrams. If you just Google the hierarchy of courts, you can find quite a few different diagrams in different formats. So if we say in the Commonwealth jurisdiction to start with, we talk about the federal hierarchy and the federal courts. So that's the High Court, the full court of the Federal Court, and the Federal Court itself as the main ones there. So the courts themselves, they deal with matters arising under Commonwealth legislation. So this is where you know where to look for case law relating to certain pieces of legislation. Is it state law or is it Commonwealth law? And that will be a guiding principle for that. There are also some national schemes like company law, etc., corporations law. And that's a national scheme, and so that is then under the federal hierarchy. So there's a bit of a list there. You can see some of the areas. I think we touched on this very early on as well when we tried to explain the legal system. So Commonwealth legislation includes trade practices, taxation, corporations, industrial, bankruptcy, family law, administrative, admiralty, intellectual property, native title, etc. And the two main courts where a matter would begin would be the federal court and the family court. So obviously family law is the family court. Now tribunals are a little bit different. They're what they term quasi-judicial functions. So they're not courts in the fullest sense, but they do have the task of making decisions in different types of disputes. And so there can be tribunals relating to the ACCC, administrative appeals, so what goes on in sort of the public service in that sort of area, migration review, refugee reviews, social security appeals, and then sort of native title tribunal as well. So if you went to that link that's on the bottom of the screen, that will give you quite a bit more detail around those different sort of courts and tribunals if you want to learn a little bit more. So that comes from the Australian government website. It's part of their information, pushing out information about things which are of importance to the nation as a whole. So this screen, this comes from the Attorney General's department at the Commonwealth level, and again we refer you to Chapter 3 of the Constitution, which talks about the judiciary, and here you can see those different areas, the High Court, the Federal Court, and it gives you a little bit of background as to what they might do, Family Court, and then the Federal Magistrates Court has been renamed about 3 years ago, has been renamed the Federal Circuit Court of Australia, and the titles of the Chief Federal Magistrate and the Federal Magistrate got changed to Chief Judge and Judge. Okay, so High Court, that's the highest court in the land and the final court of appeal in Australia. If you remember in olden days, you could sort of refer a matter back to England, but these days the highest court in the land is the High Court. And so any constitutional matters would go directly to the High Court, and then any final appeals in civil and criminal matters go to the High Court. Okay, so hopefully that all makes a bit of sense there. The full court, as I say, there is the High Court, which is also hears appeals, but you can also go to the full court rather than having special leave to appeal. So the High Court can determine what matters it feels, or what the judges feel, obviously, are appropriate to go to the High Court. So some appeals just go up to the full court. So the full court is usually a panel of 3, 4 or 5 federal court justices. So it's really worth your while taking some time to look at the different court websites. Everything's so much more transparent these days through the internet than it was, say, a decade or so ago. They're information sources in their own right. There's a lot of information about the courts and how the courts are run and who the judges are and all of those type of things. But obviously an important aspect are the judgments, which are made available these days very promptly through the different court sites. So you can see on the left-hand side there's judgment summaries. I did a screenshot a couple of days ago, but you can see that there's the most recent cases, important cases, are actually then presented there as a quick one-stop shop where you can, so if you're waiting for a decision to be handed down, you can get it very, very quickly from the website. So you can see just on the right-hand side of the screen, visit us. A lot of people go to visit the High Court. It is not a tourist attraction as such, but it is part of our democracy and a very important part. And so there's, if you are in Canberra, it's really worth going to visit the High Court there. They've got resources, so it is an information source. They've got things for students, obviously school students who are learning about the justice system as part of their social sciences. They can find materials there. There's the registry, which explains all the bits, the forms and the different ways of actually working with the courts themselves. And beneath that, you can see that there's the library catalogue, so you might like to explore to see what resources they have available as well. Importantly, under the opening hours, you can see down towards the bottom there, they've got the sittings calendar. And this is an important piece. When will, it's a bit like Parliament doesn't sit 365 days of the year, the courts don't sit that either. So they will have a program of when they will be hearing different matters when things are before the courts. So that's the High Court website. There is, and I put a link on Blackboard site as well, there's actually a 12-minute video about the High Court of Australia. So again, that might be just general knowledge, general interest for you to understand. I also put a link into something which I found on the University of Melbourne site, which is a short interview with the Honourable Michael Kirby as Chief Justice, and he explains some of the things we talk about in pretty good plain English as well. So, yeah, take a look at that on your way through. The Federal Court, so coming down the hierarchy now, here's the Federal Court and their website. And very much centre of that, it tells you the national practice areas. So as we just discussed on the way through, what matters are heard before the Federal Court as opposed to the Supreme Court in a given state, etc. So that gives you a little bit of detail, and again, there's procedural type of information, the daily court list, so what matters are being heard, and then there's some links there, so where to find a judgment, for example, forms, rules, and documents. So the Federal Court is more of a workhorse in the sense that the High Court sees itself at the top of the tree and does receive visitors. The Federal Court's not so much. It's more a place where a lot of things get done, and for the lawyers, it's more their space. The Family Court, they're all advertising Christmas already, which is really interesting to see. There again, the Family Court, and this is a bit where we looked at the scenario relating to the children who were living in England and which law would it come under, and the Hague Convention, etc., abduction of children. You can see on the right, the left-hand side, there's a lot of information about family law matters. Obviously, family law is central to the daily life of most people, and so there's a lot of things there which are explanatory in plain English for people who realise that they do have a dispute, how to work through that, and how to start beginning to understand how family law works. So judgments then, again, a quick one-stop shop to find the recent decisions, and there are also then some publications about various things in the court lists. So because it's a federal jurisdiction, there are different, so the Federal Court, there's one in each capital city, so different matters will be heard in different areas at different times. So It's cut off at the bottom on the bottom right hand side, but there's find a court location, so you can get a bit more information there. So yeah, again, I can just recommend that you sort of explore the websites and get an idea of what type of information is held in each of those areas. So this is coming down to what we said was the magistrates level, so a much lower level of matters that are heard here. They've got some links to family law as a starting point, but the tabs in the middle, the black lines going through the middle there, you've got sort of information for the public, information for lawyers, information about the government side of things, and then some media. So, but you can tell that they've got the same web designers behind them. There's a similar pattern to the way that they are structured. So you can find out a bit more there. So if we move into the states and territories and things, just looking at Queensland to start with here, not busier actually, their website. And there's a lot of information again on the left hand side, so like FAQs almost to find out about various different things. There's information here about jury selection, so in the state environment, through the Supreme Court, the criminal trials will have a jury. So there's information about jury service, and then information in the middle, but also you can see the judgments, full text of judgments from the Queensland courts. So you could go through to there. And then they've got a media stream on the left-hand side. So that's the Supreme Court. So if you did click on that middle area for the courts, here it tells you, okay, we've got these different courts in Queensland specifically. There's the Magistrates Court at the lower level, the District Court, and the Supreme Court. And it explains that all of these courts hear both civil and criminal cases. It explains where civil cases are where one party sues another to get compensation, etc., etc., whereas criminal cases are about offences against the broader community and can range, as they say, from littering to murder. So it gives you a bit of background about the magistrates' courts, which are at the real local level. So magistrates' courts hear cases in 131 locations throughout the state. So very much up, sort of scattered across everywhere. The Supreme and District Courts, the Supreme Court sits in 11 locations and the District Court's in 38 locations. So the physical building, the Supreme Court, is in Brisbane, but they do sittings in regional areas as well. So to hear cases in regional towns and remote areas. So that's where those sort of sitting dates where the judges will be at different times. And there's a big page in the website about the Supreme Court. So that's where you would go to find out more information around that. So that's just a quick snapshot. Again, you're all in different jurisdictions. So go and visit your own Supreme Court website to have a look, if you can get there, to go and actually visit the Supreme Court library if you are in a capital city. That's really worthwhile. And if you're going to be working in legal research, then go and meet the people, get to know them, get to know what services they provide, what resources they've got, and things like that. So lots to explore and enjoy. So to give a little bit more detail about the hierarchy within the states, the magistrates' courts, they deal with what we term minor civil offences. So in the civil jurisdiction, the threshold for the compensation, the idea that there's a matter that's under dispute, that the threshold is $150,000. Okay, so that is the maximum that you could be in dispute about. Criminal matters, they refer to summary offences. So minor legal matters, not the major ones. Then if you go up the tree a little bit, so the district courts or county courts, depending on which state you're in, that's a wider civil jurisdiction of up to $750,000. And then the criminal matters are more indictable offences. And then level 3 is the highest level in the states, and that is unlimited civil jurisdiction. So this is through the Supreme Courts. So anything over that $750,000 threshold, and then the most serious criminal matters. So definitely murder, rape, all those type of things will go through the Supreme Court for things on those lines. Now there are things called cross-vesting provisions as well. There's a Commonwealth Act, which is the Jurisdiction of Courts, in brackets, Cross-Vesting Act, 1987, and some complementary legislation in the different states and territories. And this actually allows matters to be dealt with in courts beyond the required jurisdiction, but in a one-way direction. The federal jurisdiction can be conferred on the state courts. So a federal matter, Commonwealth legislation matter, can be heard in the state courts, but not the other way around. And there is one case from 1999 which explains a lot of this in detail as well. So if you wanted to explore and understand a little bit more, there is a case for you to look at where this is actually discussed before the courts. Which takes us to, very naturally, law reporting. So from one case to lots of cases. So as we've said before, it's all about the doctrine of precedent, and you need a comprehensive system of law reports. And as we said early on, again, this is just repeating what we talked about at the very beginning of the course, that we need to be able to make reference to the authoritative decisions made by judges as you come down, as common law takes its part. And the authoritative ones are edited, so what's gone before the courts are edited by legally trained people, very often barristers. And they are authoritative, which is slightly different from authorized, and they are the official court-based reports. And it's the judges of the courts who decide which cases will be reported in the authorized reports. And so the judges themselves just check the authoritative report that's come from the barrister or whoever has sort of worked through it, and then it becomes an authorized version in the actual state reports. So it's all common. So it's preferable to cite authorized reports, and if you're certainly going towards or taking cases to court, it needs to be the authorized version. But some cases are published in multiple places. It's actually the same matter, but there's multiple places, and of course the unreported decision as it comes through the transcript from the actual courts themselves. So here in Australia, the Commonwealth and the states have got their own councils for law reporting. So the High Court, if you remember, the Commonwealth law reports are the authorised reports for the High Court. The federal law reports, or the FLRs, are the authorised ones from the federal court. And then different jurisdictions, so there's the local government reports of Australia, those dealing with matters before the local government. That is then the local government reports, and they're the authorised version for that. Or it can be sort of different areas of law, so there are different reports then going for trade practices, etc. The family law reports, the trade practice reports come from publishers like CCH and co in the loose leaf services that are with those as well, such as the tax cases and the company law cases. So there's a wide range of reports, and of course you can look at those. So the High Court cases, the authorised ones, the Commonwealth law reports, but other decisions might be made available through the Australian law reports or the Australian Law Journal reports. But so any further submissions to the bench High Court would only make reference to the CLRs as their authorised reports. So of course today, as we've seen through all of those court websites, decisions are made available very promptly online. High Court decisions may take longer, but very often once they are handed down, then they're available in more than one database. They're obviously high priority in terms of the legal profession. The unreported decisions are available through the courts and, of course, online these days as well. But very often older unreported decisions would not necessarily be online and take a little bit more effort to locate. The law librarians, the Australian Law Librarians Association, ALA, they've got a really good network of law librarians who they just email each other to find out where something might be available. So there's a quick way to locate even the harder type of things. Interestingly, Justice Hayden, way back in 2003, so quite a while ago, was getting concerned about the ease of access to the wealth of decisions. Okay, what's happening? Yes, it's good to be able to find them, but also some of the legal professions feel that it's too easy to find too much, and it's making sort of the work of the courts quite a challenge because many decisions are being put up in part of the legal the matters before the court. So they're concerned that there's too much information, like information overload, compared to sort of a generation ago when there wasn't access. The actual legal research task was done quite differently. So that's a point to bear in mind. So in terms of the decision that is relating to which cases are selected. So the All England Law Reports, in their publications, the publishing director has actually sort of set some criteria, which is worth noting, I think. Whether it makes new law, so the situation is quite novel or new, or it extends the application of existing principles. Or sometimes it's a modern judicial restatement of established principles. Very often a decision will clarify conflicting decisions of lower courts. So it's a bit of an arbiter around the decisions that are made by the lower courts. Definitely there's the important area of interpreting legislation, where it's going to have a wide application. So it's a common matter for society, and that legislation, rather than have it confusing, needs to be interpreted. It might interpret a commonly found clause for some reason, and it might clarify an important point of practice or procedure. Appeal cases are very often actually more about points of law than the actual matters of fact, and so they tend to be reported more often as well. So back to the authorised law reports. The University of Melbourne has got a great resource there that has got the lists of them as well. And I think we've talked about these before. I think you've probably sort of got a handle, hopefully, around the different ones. And then some of the unauthorised law reports. And that's a screenshot from there. So I think I made an error, I'm just hesitating here, just to go back very quickly. I think I said in that one, the federal law reports in the middle is not the authorised. I think I did say as I went through it that the federal courts reports are the authorised ones. This just refers to the different jurisdictions of the different courts themselves. So sorry about that, I corrected myself. Right. So again, you need to become familiar with the abbreviations, and they're plentiful. You can find many different sources where abbreviations are made available. So the difference of, as you cite the the law reports in different ways. The Cardiff Index, if you remember, is a really quick and easy way to go. Casebase with LexisNexis AU, they've got abbreviations. And then the law libraries put things out as well. The legal encyclopedias will have a list of abbreviations. So there's lots of different sources you can go to if you're not quite sure what the acronym is actually refers to. Then some of the online environment. This is from Ostly, which is a major legal site that is one of the, doesn't charge for its resources. It's been funded through different research grants over the years. It's not necessarily the best designed website, but it provides access to great range, as you can see. So all of those decisions, all those links on the second half, the lower half of the screen, actually are all around Commonwealth case law. So on the left-hand side at the top, you've got High Court, Family Court, Federal Circuit Court, and the older Federal Magistrates Court for family law, etc. So all of those are there. But then after the gap, you can see those different range of areas for the tribunals, the Industrial Relations Commission, and all of those. So very, very wide range of different decisions and ranges of dates. They're not necessarily comprehensive. There are gaps with a number of the resources that are made available on Ofsted. So you need to take care if you are doing research in that area. So that screen just provides you a little bit more detail about the sets of reports for the federal jurisdiction. And so that's just there for information, if you like, so where you might be able to go. The Supreme Courts of the Territories, because that comes under the ACT and Northern Territory, are sort of different from the actual states, of course, so they fall under that umbrella. So the major suppliers, Ofsted, then LexisNexis and Westlaw. So the value of some of those are that with the subscription services like LexisNexis and Westlaw, they are all linked through to commentary about the cases as well. So not just so there's discussion around the materials. So we'll look at those in a lot more detail next week. We've got 2 guest speakers next week. We've got people from LexisNexis coming along to talk about particularly case-based, but a few other resources available on their platform. And then we've also got a trainer from Westlaw coming to join us as well. So they'll give you some little tutorials around the resources, which should be quite interesting. So I encourage you to spend some time during the week checking out the platforms, LexisNexis and Westlaw, so as they move through and navigate through the different areas of their platforms, you're familiar, so you won't feel too lost about where they're taking you. So that would be good. At the state levels, the authorised reports, so as an example, the Queensland reports, there are online. You can get them from 1975 onwards on LexisNexis. Sorry, that should be unreported is the SCQ. I've got a typo there. So Supreme Court of Queensland website, Ofsted. And there's also Barnett Jade as well. That's another free-to-air resource that is trying to make materials available, sort of high-quality materials available to the legal profession. They felt that the legal profession didn't have access to high-quality resources the way the medical profession did, through Medline and PubMed and different things like that. So they're trying to improve things so that there is easy access to various things. Western Australia, the Western Australian reports, they are available through Westlaw AU and LexisNexis AU, but Queensland, for example, is not available through Westlaw AU. So again, you can't assume that all the publishers are providing access to all of the resources. You need to sort of be familiar with what they do provide access to there. And just as a memory boost as well, don't forget that sometimes you do have to access the English reports. So just a general familiarity with some of those areas and how they're referred to. So like the appeal cases, Chancery, Queen's Bench, Family Division. So relating to those sort of areas, rather similar to Australia with that. And there are weekly reports, and there are some All England law reports, and the older Longnet reports. So lots of those just to become just generally aware of, so that if you do see them referred to, you will know where you might find them. Just spend a few minutes now looking, okay, if that's all where you find the cases, but what does a case actually look like? What does a law report look like? And there's some information in the Nemes and Cops text which is worth having a look at for a bit more explanation. The screenshot here is just of, it's taken from the textbook. They've updated, this is from an older edition of means and costs. The newer edition doesn't actually annotate the sections of the law report in the same way. But if you look down the left-hand side, you can see how there's a typical case structure. So you've got which court it is at the very top, and then you've got the names of the parties, and then the court name. So this is the appeal division of the court, so the Court of Criminal Appeal in Victoria. And then because it's an appellate court, there's more than one judge, and you've got the names of them that are presented there, and the dates of the hearing, so when actually it went through the courts. Then you have in bold a series of catchwords, which provides, I suppose, like keywords, but you'll notice it also includes the legislation, so Evidence Act 1958, and then also the Crimes Act 1958, so those are referred to there. And then the head note begins. So that gives you a synopsis, a bit of like an abstract about the case. If you sort of continued over, I've only got some bits of it, the type of proceedings are given, that it was an application for leave to appeal. The counsel, okay, so the barristers who are appearing, and it's noticed there in abbreviation in Latin that the judgment was reserved, so it wasn't handed down on the same day. And there's further information which then provides the judgment itself. They've got lots of dotted lines, they haven't got the full text in this example here. And then the order, the names of the solicitors, and the name of the reporter, so who actually prepared the report and checked it. So these slides, just to reduce that down and bring it all together, these are the typical elements of the law report. And you'll note, you'll become familiar with all of those because the fields, especially in sort of the major databases like LexisNexis and Westlaw AU, the fields that you would be searching would actually reflect those typical elements of a law report. So you can track that down. So think about that when you do start exploring LexisNexis and Westlaw, etc., as to how they structure their search form and why they might be able to do that. So here's an example from First Point, which is in Westlaw AU. So there again, you can search these fields. You can search for a case name, for a citation, so that and the year, the jurisdiction, court, the judge's name, where the legislation was judicially considered or words and phrases judicially considered, the case digest, the classification, the legal classification, etc., etc. So it is worthwhile understanding how the case is structured because that will help you in your research activities. The University of Melbourne Guide on Australian Case Law is a good one. They've got some, as you can see along the top of the tabs there, there's a good introduction, then there's some information around case reporting, the case citations, finding a case, how to follow a case history, and where to go for further help. So that's been very well prepared, I think, to help people, not just students, but new people in that area. So that's sort of the first part of tonight's presentation. There's a video tutorial on the Blackboard site, so that's a good place to go to sort of work through as well. As I said just now, look at the library guides, for example, the University of Melbourne. The chapters of the different books that we've referred you to is really worth having a look at to sort of have some understanding about how that's all presented. And then just go and rummage, go to a series of printed law reports to get a feel. Sometimes it's hard in the online environment to understand exactly where you are and how to navigate through. So maybe go and look at some hard copy first. There must be time for wine. There must be buy at Blackboard, sorry. Some typos in here. In week 2 on Blackboard, we've got the tables of subscribed and free resources, and there's one for each state as well as the Commonwealth. So that will help you become familiar with which resources, you know, like we sort of said, that the Queensland reports were in LexisNexis but not in Westlaw. That will be a guide for you to sort of help you locate things. And then the commercial platforms, which we're going to have a good session with next week anyway, but there are videos as well that introduce you to some of their systems. So we'll be looking at all of that next week. So watch out for that. So it's about 10 to, so we'll take a quick break for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and just talk a little bit about researching case law, some of the things that you might need to think about.